The most dangerous thing a man can do is underestimate the woman who learned how to survive without him. Ethan Whitmore sat at the head of the conference table on the 38th floor of a glass tower in Midtown Manhattan, pretending the room did not know he was desperate. The city stretched behind him in a glittering grid of steel, traffic, and late afternoon sunlight, all of it reflecting off the polished windows like a world that still belonged to men who never admitted when they were losing. His suit was custom, his watch cost more than most people's cars, and his smile had been practiced in bathroom mirrors, boardrooms, and charity galas for nearly 20 years. But beneath the silk tie and the calm voice, his company was bleeding. Whitmore Capital, the firm he had once introduced as his legacy, was now 3 missed payments, 2 angry investors, and 1 disastrous acquisition away from collapse. Across the table, his chief financial officer kept tapping a silver pen against a folder marked confidential, a tiny nervous sound Ethan wanted to silence with a look. Instead, he glanced at the empty chair at the far end of the table, the one reserved for the representative from Bennett Holdings. No one knew much about them, and that was exactly what made them powerful. In less than 5 years, Bennett Holdings had become the quiet hand behind some of the most shocking corporate turnarounds in the country. They bought failing companies, cleaned out bad leadership, rebuilt public trust, and somehow made disaster look like strategy. Ethan needed them. That fact tasted bitter in his mouth. He had spent his life being the man other people came to for rescue, not the man sitting stiff-backed under recessed lighting, waiting for strangers to decide whether his empire deserved another breath. "They're 3 minutes late," he said, though nobody had asked. His lawyer, Grant Hollis, adjusted his glasses. "They can afford to be." Ethan hated him a little for saying it out loud. Before he could answer, the double doors opened. A young assistant stepped in first, pale and composed, holding a leather portfolio against her chest. Behind her came 2 attorneys in dark suits. Then the room shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was worse than that. It shifted the way air changes before a storm, the way people stop moving when they realize history has just entered the room wearing heels. Claire Bennett walked in without hurry. For one impossible second, Ethan's mind refused to make sense of her. The woman crossing his conference room could not be the same woman he had watched leave their Greenwich house 5 years earlier with rain in her hair, 1 suitcase in her hand, and humiliation pressed into the set of her shoulders. That Claire had been quiet. Broken, he had told people. Unprepared for real life, he had told himself. This woman wore an ivory suit cut with clean, ruthless elegance, her dark blonde hair swept back from a face that had lost its softness and found something far more inconvenient: command. She did not look surprised to see him. She did not look wounded. She looked like a woman arriving exactly where she intended to be. Ethan stood too quickly, the legs of his chair scraping the hardwood floor. The sound made him seem startled, and he despised that. "Claire," he said, her name leaving his mouth with the old entitlement still clinging to it. She paused beside the empty chair, placed her black portfolio on the table, and looked at him with eyes he remembered once watching for approval across dinner parties and investor events. Now they gave him nothing. "Ms. Bennett," she said. 2 words. Calm, polite, final. Around the table, no one breathed loudly enough to be noticed. Ethan felt heat crawl beneath his collar. 5 years ago, he had stood beneath the marble archway of their home and told her, "Without me, you have nothing." He had believed it. Everyone had believed it. His friends, his lawyers, his family, even the society pages that reduced their divorce to a neat little tragedy about a wife who had married above her weight and fallen back to earth. But now Claire Bennett sat at the head of his table, opened the portfolio bearing her name, and turned the first page of the document that would decide whether Whitmore Capital lived or died. Claire's voice did not rise as she began reviewing the proposal, and that was what made it unbearable. Ethan had prepared himself for anger. Anger would have made sense. Anger would have given him something to manage, something to dismiss as emotion, resentment, unfinished business. But Claire spoke like a surgeon reading a chart, precise, steady, almost merciful in her restraint. She moved through Whitmore Capital's debt structure, failed investments, inflated projections, and leadership weaknesses with a calm that stripped every excuse of its polish. Each page she turned sounded louder than it should have in that room. Ethan watched her hands, elegant and unhurried, and remembered those same hands smoothing his tie before investor dinners, correcting spelling errors in his speeches at 1 o'clock in the morning, writing thank you notes to clients whose names he had forgotten the second the checks cleared. Back then, he had called it support. Now, hearing her identify the cracks in his company with almost frightening clarity, he realized support had been a smaller word than what she had actually given him. 5 years earlier, Claire Bennett had not been simply Ethan Whitmore's wife. She had been the quiet architecture behind his public brilliance. She remembered which venture partner had a daughter at Duke University, which board member disliked seafood, which donor preferred handwritten cards, which retired banker still mattered even after he left the room. Ethan understood numbers. Claire understood people. In the beginning, that combination had made them powerful. He pitched. She listened. He dazzled. She repaired. He promised. She made sure someone believed him. Their first apartment had been barely 900 square feet on the Upper West Side, with a faulty radiator and a kitchen so narrow they had to turn sideways to pass each other. Claire had worked at a boutique branding agency then, earning enough to cover groceries, utilities, and the small emergencies Ethan called temporary setbacks. She had believed in him with the kind of faith only a young wife can mistake for wisdom. When Whitmore Capital landed its first major client, Ethan lifted her off the ground in their tiny living room and told her they had done it. By the time the firm moved into polished offices downtown, the word they had quietly disappeared. It became my company, my investors, my strategy, my legacy. Claire noticed the change slowly, the way a person notices winter arriving, not in one dramatic storm, but in small losses of warmth. He stopped asking for her opinion and started asking whether his dinner jacket looked better in charcoal or black. He introduced her as his wife, never as the woman who had helped shape the firm's earliest identity. At galas, he placed his hand at the small of her back, not as affection, but as positioning. She became part of the room's decoration, lovely, expected, silent. Then Vanessa Cole arrived, all bright smiles and polished ambition, a junior consultant with a talent for making powerful men feel misunderstood. She laughed at Ethan's sharpest comments, praised his instincts, and looked at Claire with the sweet pity of someone measuring curtains in a house she planned to occupy. Claire sensed the affair long before she found proof. It was in the locked phone screen, the late meetings, the new cologne, the way Ethan began criticizing things he once loved about her. Her quietness became weakness. Her caution became fear. Her loyalty became dependence. By the time his lawyers drafted the divorce papers, he had already rewritten their marriage into a story where he had built everything, and she had merely stood nearby, smiling in expensive dresses. Sitting across from him now, Claire did not need to correct the past aloud. She had brought something far more efficient than pain. She had brought documentation. The documentation began with dates Ethan had forgotten because forgetting had always been one of his luxuries. Claire had not had that luxury. She remembered the morning his legal team sent over the first settlement draft, printed on thick paper that made cruelty look expensive. She had been sitting alone at the long kitchen island in the Greenwich house, the same island she had chosen after 3 weekends of driving through Connecticut showrooms while Ethan was in San Francisco convincing investors that Whitmore Capital was a family-built institution. Family-built. That phrase had appeared in magazines, on donor plaques, in his speeches, and even in the company's anniversary video. Annoyed, handsome in the careless way that had once made strangers forgive him before he even asked. "You should take the apartment downtown," he said. "It will be easier for you than trying to start from nothing." Claire looked at him then, really looked, and understood that he was not offering kindness. He was offering a smaller cage. "No," she said. It was the first word in years that felt entirely hers. He gave a short laugh, the kind he used when a junior analyst said something foolish. "Claire, be practical. Without me, you have nothing." She did not answer. She stepped into the rain with her suitcases, her wedding ring in her coat pocket, and $37 in cash because her cards had been frozen pending account review. Her phone buzzed with messages she did not open. Her shoes filled slowly with water as she waited for the rideshare car at the end of the long driveway, refusing to let the driver see her cry. She spent the first night in a budget hotel off Interstate 95, the kind with humming lights, thin towels, and a vending machine that took her last $5 bill without giving her the bottle of water. It should have broken her. Maybe a kinder world would not require women to be broken before it believes they are strong. but this world had never been especially kind. At 3:15 in the morning, Claire sat on the edge of the bed and opened the old canvas tote she had grabbed from the hall closet. Inside, beneath a sweater and a folder of tax forms, was her mother's worn leather notebook. Margaret Bennett had been gone for 4 years by then, but her handwriting still had the power to make the room feel occupied. Claire turned the pages until she found a sentence underlined twice in blue ink. Never build your life inside someone else's name. She read it once, then again. Then she took off her wedding ring, placed it on the nightstand, and said her own name aloud in the empty room, quietly at first, then stronger. Claire Bennett. Not Mrs. Whitmore. Not Ethan's wife. Not the woman people pitted over salads and champagne. Claire Bennett. By sunrise, she had opened her laptop, made a list of every skill she had ever been told did not count. And beside each one, she wrote a price. Claire's first office was not an office at all. It was a corner table in a coffee shop in Brooklyn where the owner let her sit for hours because she always bought the same $6 tea and never complained about the draft from the front door. In winter, she worked with her coat over her shoulders and her laptop balanced beside a chipped ceramic mug. In summer, she stayed until closing, walking back to her sublet with swollen feet, tired eyes, and a mind that refused to surrender. She named the company Bennett Strategy at first because holdings sounded ridiculous for a woman who owned one laptop, 2 blazers, and a folding chair she had found through an online marketplace. Her first clients were not glamorous. A family bakery in Queens whose sons could not agree on whether to modernize the logo. A struggling florist in Hoboken whose reviews had been damaged by one angry customer with too much time and a keyboard. A retired couple in New Jersey trying to sell their small manufacturing business before medical bills swallowed their savings. None of them could afford the consultants Ethan used to entertain over $18 cocktails, and that was why Claire understood them. They were embarrassed, frightened, proud, and exhausted. They did not need someone to impress them. They needed someone to see what was still worth saving. Claire saw it because she had learned to look for value under damage. She rebuilt websites, rewrote mission statements, negotiated payment plans, cleaned up customer messaging, trained owners to speak clearly about their own worth, and charged less than she should have because she was still learning the difference between humility and self-erasure. Every invoice paid on time felt like oxygen. Every referral felt like proof. She kept a spreadsheet so detailed it became almost sacred. Income, rent, taxes, groceries, savings, software, transportation, emergency fund. The woman Ethan had dismissed as decorative learned cash flowed the way some people learn a second language, awkwardly at first, then fluently enough to survive. She sold her wedding ring in March. The jeweler looked at the diamond through a lens and offered a number so small it almost made her laugh. For 1 second, she saw the ring on her hand at 28, saw herself believing forever could be secured by a beautiful object and a man with excellent posture. Then she accepted the money and used it to hire a freelance designer for her first real client presentation. That presentation won her a regional hotel group in Vermont. The hotel group introduced her to a private equity associate in Boston. The associate introduced her to a founder in Austin whose company was drowning after a public relations mistake. Claire flew coach, middle seat, with her knees pressed against her bag for nearly 4 hours, then walked into a conference room and saved a company twice the size of Ethan's first fund. She did not save it with charm. She saved it by telling the truth in a room full of people paid to avoid it. Within 2 years, Bennett Strategy became Bennett & Company. She rented a real office on the 4th floor of a converted warehouse near Dumbo, with exposed brick, uneven heating, and windows that looked toward the East River if you stood at exactly the right angle. She hired a former journalist named Daniel Price to run crisis communications, a tax-minded operations director named Marissa Lane, and 2 analysts young enough to believe work could still change lives if nobody ruined them first. Claire built rules from the ruins of her marriage. No client was allowed to hide debt from the team. No founder was allowed to blame failure entirely on employees. No woman in her office would ever be called supportive when she was doing executive work. The company grew quietly, then suddenly. A restaurant chain recovered under her guidance. A nonprofit avoided closure. A regional clothing brand doubled revenue after Claire repositioned it around American manufacturing and honest wages. People began to whisper her name in rooms Ethan no longer entered. By the fourth year, investors who once ignored her were asking for breakfast meetings. By the fifth, Bennett and Company had become Bennett Holdings, with acquisition funds, restructuring teams, and enough private capital to buy broken companies from men who had mistaken noise for leadership. Claire never sent Ethan a headline. She never corrected the people who assumed she had disappeared. She simply kept building until silence became the most expensive thing in the room. The first document Claire placed on the conference table was not an insult, though Ethan felt it like one. It was a timeline. Clean columns, verified dates, client names, investor introductions, campaign strategies, event records, follow-up correspondence, and early branding proposals from the first 3 years of Whitmore Capital. At the bottom of nearly every page was a name Ethan had trained himself not to see. Claire Bennett. Not Claire Whitmore. Bennett. Her maiden name appeared in email signatures, calendar invitations, donor lists, hotel contracts, and handwritten notes scanned into digital records by someone on her team with the patience of an archivist and the cold discipline of a prosecutor. Grant Hollis leaned forward, his face tightening by degrees as he recognized documents his own office had once dismissed as informal. Claire did not look at him. She looked at Ethan. Your current problem is not only debt, she said. It is credibility. Whitmore Capital was built on a story of singular leadership. That story is no longer useful because it was never fully true. Ethan heard his chief financial officer inhale sharply. The sound was small, but in a room like that, small sounds became verdicts. This is personal, Ethan said, because it was the only defense that came quickly enough. Claire turned another page. No. Personal would have been answering the emails you sent my first year out. Personal would have been correcting Vanessa Cole when she told people I had taken a settlement and disappeared. Personal would have been giving interviews, leaking records, or using your mother's lunch circle the way your family used it against me. Her voice remained level, and somehow that made every sentence land harder. This is business. The screen behind her changed to a financial model so precise that Ethan felt the floor of the room tilt beneath him. Bennett Holdings was offering to acquire 51% of Whitmore Capital at a valuation far below what Ethan had boasted about only 18 months earlier, but still high enough to prevent immediate collapse. The conditions were severe. Independent audit, restructuring of senior leadership, removal of Vanessa from any advisory capacity, liquidation of 2 failing investment vehicles, board oversight for 3 years, and Ethan, founder, public face, self-declared architect of the firm, would step down as chief executive officer within 90 days. You cannot expect me to agree to that, he said. Claire folded her hands on top of the file. I do not expect anything from you anymore. The room went very still. 5 years ago, those words might have shattered her to say. Now they seemed almost gentle, like setting down a glass without breaking it. Ethan looked around the table, searching for loyalty. His lawyer avoided his eyes. His chief financial officer studied the numbers with the expression of a man seeing the only bridge left across a flood. 2 board members, both men who had once toasted Ethan at private dinners, were already whispering to each other in the language of survival. If I refuse? Ethan asked. Claire nodded once, as if she had prepared for the question because she had prepared for everything. Then Bennett Holdings walks away. Your lenders proceed. Your investors demand disclosures. Your pending acquisition fails. By Friday, the market will know what this room already knows. She paused, not for cruelty, but for accuracy. You are out of time. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time since she entered, Claire saw the boy inside the man. Frightened, cornered, furious that charm had finally met a locked door. There had been a time when that sight would have pulled her toward him. She would have softened the truth, dressed it in reassurance, offered him a path back to dignity at the expense of her own. That reflex was gone now, not because she had become cold, but because she had finally learned that compassion without boundaries was just another form of self-abandonment. You built all this because of me, Ethan said quietly. It was meant to wound, or perhaps to claim some final ownership over her rise. Claire looked toward the windows, where Manhattan burned gold in the late sun, and for a moment she saw the budget hotel, the stolen sleep, the coffee shop table, the first paid invoice, the women in her office laughing over takeout at midnight because a client had survived another impossible week. Then she looked back at him. No, Ethan, she said. I built this because I survived you. No one moved. No one rescued him from the sentence. Claire slid the pen across the table, not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply far enough for him to reach it. Outside, 38 floors below, traffic crawled through the city in bright ribbons of red and white. Indifferent to the private collapse of a man who had once believed the world could not continue without his permission. The pen remained between them like a small silver dare. Ethan stared at it for so long that Claire wondered whether he truly understood what had changed, or whether some stubborn, ancient part of him still expected the room to bend back into the shape he preferred. His fingers twitched once against the table, but he did not reach for it. Pride, Claire had learned, was rarely loud at the end. Sometimes it simply sat there, overdressed and underprepared, refusing to move while the water rose. Grant Hollis cleared his throat. Ethan, he said carefully, using the tone attorneys reserve for clients who are about to choose ruin for the sake of ego. We should review the terms with the board before making any statement. Ethan turned on him with a look that might have worked 5 years earlier, back when people still confused his confidence with competence. Grant did not flinch. That, more than anything, seemed to frighten him. Around the table, the board members began asking Claire's team questions, cautious at first, then faster. What would happen to existing investors? How soon could liquidity be stabilized? Would Bennett Holdings retain the New York office? How many employees would be affected? Claire answered each question without hesitation. She had not come to punish the staff, she explained. She had come to stop the company from collapsing under leadership that had mistaken performance for substance. The analysts would stay. The client service teams would stay. The accounting department would be protected through the audit. The people who had done the work would not pay for the decisions of the people who had taken the applause. At that, Marissa Lane slid a second folder across the table, and Claire opened it to a page of projected payroll safeguards. Ethan looked at the numbers, then at her, and for a moment his face loosened into something almost human. You planned for them, he said. Claire held his gaze. Someone should have. The sentence was quiet, but it carried the weight of every employee who had ever been told to be grateful while executives gambled with their paychecks. Ethan leaned back slowly, as if the chair itself had become unfamiliar. He looked older than he had when she entered the room. Not weaker, exactly, just less protected by the lighting. Claire could see the gray at his temples, the faint crease between his brows, the exhaustion under the expensive skincare and tailored cloth. There was no satisfaction in noticing it. That surprised her. For years, she had imagined this moment in brief flashes she was ashamed to admit even to herself. Ethan shocked. Ethan sorry. Ethan finally understanding what it felt like to be dismissed, cornered, spoken over by people who had already decided your worth. But the real moment had less fire in it than she expected. It was not sweet. It was not cruel. It was simply clean. A door closing in a house she no longer lived in. Claire, Ethan said again, softer this time. Not Miss Bennett. Claire. The old name in the old voice, worn smooth from use. She waited. Did you ever think about telling me? The question was absurd enough to move through the room like cold air. Daniel Price, seated near the wall with his communications folder, looked down at his notes to hide his expression. Claire did not need to hide hers. Telling you what? She asked. That you were building this. He gestured vaguely toward the portfolio, the company, the impossible fact of her. That you were becoming this. Claire almost smiled, but not because it was funny. Because even now, his question found a way to place him at the center of her work. As if her success had been a secret withheld from him, rather than a life rebuilt without asking his permission. No, she said. I was busy. Grant lowered his eyes. One of the board members coughed into his fist. Ethan's jaw tightened, but the old anger did not fully arrive. There was nowhere useful for it to go. He picked up the pen at last. His hand hovered over the signature line, and Claire saw the precise second he understood that signing would save the company, but end the myth of him. Refusing would preserve the myth for perhaps 2 more days, until lenders, reporters, and creditors tore it apart without elegance. Either way, the story he had told about himself was over. He signed, not with the flourish she remembered from charity checks and glossy annual reports, but with a cramped, controlled movement that made the ink look heavier than it was. When he finished, he placed the pen down with care, as though anything louder might expose him further. Claire signed next. Her signature was steady, clear, and unmistakably Bennett. The room exhaled in pieces. Papers shifted. Phones unlocked. The machinery of consequence began its quiet work. Ethan watched her close the folder. "What happens now?" he asked. Claire stood, smoothing the front of her ivory jacket. "Now we do what should have been done years ago," she said. "We tell the truth, and we protect the people who kept this place running while you were protecting your image." Then she turned from him to the board, and the meeting continued without waiting for his permission. By the time the meeting ended, the sky outside had turned the deep blue of early evening, and the conference room lights had brightened automatically, as if the building itself wanted to pretend nothing irreversible had happened. People stood carefully, gathered folders, exchanged restrained handshakes, and spoke in the hushed tones used after funerals, lawsuits, and failed mergers. Ethan remained seated while the room moved around him. For years, motion had followed him. Assistants hurried when he entered. Analysts straightened when he paused behind their chairs. Investors laughed before deciding whether he had said something funny. Now the motion belonged to Claire. Board members approached her first. Grant Hollis asked Marissa for a copy of the revised transition schedule. The chief financial officer, a tired man named Peter Sloan, shook Claire's hand with both of his and thanked her in a voice that cracked just enough to reveal how close he had been to panic. Claire accepted the gratitude without theatrics. She had learned not to confuse being needed with being loved, and not to confuse respect with noise. Daniel Price stepped beside her near the windows, holding his tablet. "The press statement is ready for review," he said. "No blame language. Focus on continuity, investor protection, and strategic restructuring." Claire nodded. "Send it to legal, then schedule release for 7:30 tomorrow morning." Across the room, Ethan looked up sharply. "Tomorrow?" Claire turned toward him. "Yes. That gives me no time to prepare." She studied him for a moment, not unkindly. "You had 5 years." The sentence landed softly, almost politely, which made it worse. Ethan pushed back his chair and stood, but the old height of him seemed altered, as if posture could not survive a signed contract. "Vanessa will see it before I speak to her," he said. The name entered the room like perfume sprayed over smoke. Claire did not react, but Peter Sloan glanced at the table, and Grant suddenly became very interested in closing his briefcase. Vanessa Cole had not been in the meeting, but her fingerprints were everywhere. Failed lifestyle partnerships, advisory fees paid for vague influence work, client dinners that produced photographs instead of revenue, a social media rebranding campaign so expensive and hollow that Daniel had called it a chandelier on a sinking boat. "Vanessa was copied on 3 prior warnings from your finance department," Claire said. She ignored them. Ethan's face tightened. "You do not know her." "I know invoices," Claire replied. "They are less charming, but more honest." For a second, the room threatened to remember it had once been capable of laughter. No one allowed it. Ethan looked away first. It should have satisfied her, watching him defend the woman who had once smiled over champagne while Claire's life was being quietly dismantled. But Claire felt only the strange, steady distance that comes when a wound becomes a scar, and the scar no longer asks to be touched. Her phone vibrated in her jacket pocket. A message from Marissa appeared on the screen. "Employees are waiting downstairs. Word is spreading." Claire looked at the time. 6:42. Hundreds of people in the building below were probably refreshing email, whispering in break rooms, calling spouses from stairwells, wondering whether tomorrow would bring layoffs, humiliation, or locked doors. She remembered that feeling too well, the terror of decisions being made by people who would never have to skip dinner because of them. "I want an all-staff meeting in the auditorium in 20 minutes, she said. Daniel glanced up. Tonight. Ethan frowned. "That is unnecessary. Staff communication should go through established channels." Claire picked up her portfolio. "Established channels are part of why nobody trusts you." She walked past him toward the door, and this time he did not stop her. The hallway outside Whitmore Capital's executive suite was lined with framed magazine covers, award plaques, and photographs of Ethan shaking hands with men who looked like they had never carried their own luggage. Claire passed them without slowing. At the elevator bank, she caught her reflection in the dark glass between the brushed steel doors. Ivory suit, calm face, her mother's small pearl earrings. For a moment, behind her own reflection, she saw the woman from the budget hotel, sitting barefoot on thin carpet, pricing skills she had been taught to give away for free. The elevator opened with a quiet chime. Claire stepped inside, and as the doors closed, she felt no triumph, no rush of vengeance, no hunger to look back. She felt something rarer and far more useful. Responsibility. 38 floors below, people were waiting to learn whether the name Bennett meant another corporate predator had arrived, or whether, for once, someone powerful remembered what it felt like to be powerless. The auditorium on the 12th floor had never been designed for honesty. It had been designed for quarterly celebrations, investor visits, staged applause, and those polished speeches Ethan loved giving beneath blue lights and a screen filled with upward arrows. By 7:15 that evening, every seat was full, and people stood along the walls with phones in their hands and worry written plainly across their faces. Analysts in rolled-up sleeves whispered beside client managers still wearing headsets around their necks. Assistants clustered near the back. A woman from accounting held a paper cup of coffee with both hands, as if warmth alone could keep bad news away. Claire stood behind the side curtain for a moment and listened to the room breathe. Not speak. Breathe. There was a difference. Fear had a sound when it gathered in large numbers, a low electrical hum made of rent payments, daycare pickups, student loans, mortgage rates, medical bills, aging parents, and the 1,000 practical obligations that never appeared in glossy founder profiles. Daniel stood beside her with the statement loaded on his tablet. "You do not have to do this personally," he said. Claire looked through the thin opening in the curtain at the employees of the company that had once helped make Ethan famous and had nearly been ruined by the same appetite that fed his fame. "Yes," she said. "I do." When she stepped onto the stage, the room did not applaud. That was a mercy. Applause would have been dishonest, and Claire had no patience left for decorative noise. She walked to the lectern, placed both hands lightly on either side, and waited until the whispers thinned into silence. In the front row, Peter Sloan sat with his shoulders bent forward, looking like a man who had spent months carrying a secret too heavy to name. Ethan entered late and stood near the back beside Grant Hollis. He did not come to the front. Claire noticed, but did not acknowledge him. The employees deserved a room not organized around his ego. "My name is Claire Bennett," she began. "As of this evening, Bennett Holdings has signed an agreement to acquire a controlling interest in Whitmore Capital." A ripple moved through the crowd, sharp and immediate. Someone whispered, "Acquire?" Someone else said, "So we are being sold?" Claire let the fear surface. Interrupting it would only teach it to hide. "I know what many of you are thinking," she continued. "You are wondering whether your jobs are safe. You are wondering whether tomorrow morning you will find out from a press release what should have been said to your face. You are wondering whether the people who made the worst decisions will walk away protected while the people who stayed late, answered calls, fixed errors, and kept clients calm will pay the price." A few faces changed then. Not relaxed, not trusting, but listening. Claire looked across the room, taking in the young man in the second row with ink on his cuff, the older receptionist near the aisle with red eyes, the operations team standing shoulder to shoulder against the side wall. "I cannot promise nothing will change," she said. "That would be insulting. Things must change, because what happened here cannot continue. There will be an independent audit. There will be restructuring. There will be difficult conversations. But the first priority is not protecting reputations. The first priority is protecting the people who did honest work inside a dishonest story." The room was silent now in a different way. Claire could feel Ethan at the back, could almost hear his discomfort without turning around. For years, he had spoken to employees as if they were an extension of his ambition. Claire spoke to them as if they had lives outside the building, because they did. "Payroll will be secured for the next 6 months during transition," she said. "Client service teams will remain in place. No employee below director level will be laid off during the first 90 days without review by Bennett Holdings. Anyone asked to cooperate with the audit will receive legal guidance and protection from retaliation. If you reported concerns before tonight and were ignored, you will be heard now." A sound passed through the auditorium, not applause yet, but breath returning to people who had been holding it for too long. Peter covered his mouth with one hand. The woman from accounting lowered her coffee cup and stared at Claire as if trying to decide whether. Relief was safe to feel. Claire understood. Hope, when offered by powerful people, often came with hidden fees. I was once told that without the right name beside mine, I had nothing, Claire said, and for the first time, her voice softened. Some of you may have been made to feel the same way in this building. Replaceable. Invisible. Lucky to be allowed in the room. That ends tonight. At the back, Ethan looked down. Not dramatically. Not ruined for public satisfaction. Just down, like a man finally seeing the floor beneath the stage he had built. Claire closed the folder in front of her. Tomorrow will be hard, she said, but it will be honest. And honest is a place where broken things can finally be repaired. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Then someone in the middle rows began to clap. Another joined. Then another. The applause rose unevenly, cautiously, like rain beginning on a roof, until it filled the auditorium with something Claire had not heard in Ethan's world for a very long time. Trust being offered, not demanded. The applause did not erase the fear in the auditorium, but it changed its shape. Fear, Claire knew, was not something leadership could simply talk away with warm phrases and a slideshow. Fear needed proof, and proof took time. Still, as people began standing, turning to one another, wiping their eyes discreetly or checking their phones with shaking hands, the room felt less like a company waiting for a sentence and more like a group of human beings allowed, finally, to stop pretending. Claire stepped down from the stage instead of disappearing through the side exit. That was deliberate. Ethan would have vanished through the executive hallway, protected by assistants and tinted glass, leaving someone else to absorb the questions. Claire walked directly into them. The first person who approached her was the receptionist from the lobby, a woman in her late 50s named Nora Ellis, whose name Claire had learned from the employee directory before the meeting because names mattered. Nora held a stack of visitor badges against her chest like a shield. "My husband is having surgery next month," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "If there are benefits changes, I need to know before I make decisions." Claire did not offer a bright smile. Bright smiles were cheap in moments like that. "Your health benefits remain active through the transition," she said. "Human Resources will send written confirmation tonight, and Marissa Lane will make sure there is a direct contact for medical coverage questions." Nora blinked once, then nodded as if she had been given permission to keep standing. Next came a junior analyst who admitted he had flagged one of the failing investment vehicles 6 months earlier and had been told to stay in his lane. Then a client services manager said 2 major accounts had threatened to leave because they no longer trusted Ethan's projections. Then an assistant, no older than 25, quietly explained that Vanessa Cole's office had demanded event budgets be coded under client development even when no clients were invited. Claire listened to all of it, not with outrage, not with performative shock, but with the disciplined attention of someone building a map from wreckage. Daniel took notes. Marissa gathered names. Peter Sloan stood nearby looking increasingly pale, not because he was guilty of everything, but because he had survived by looking away from too much. At the back of the auditorium, Ethan watched the line forming around Claire, and something in him seemed to fold inward. This had once been his building, his stage, his people. Yet most of them were speaking to her with a trust he had demanded for years and never earned. The realization did not make him noble. It made him quiet. Grant Hollis approached him with a phone in hand. "Vanessa has called 9 times, he said. Ethan did not take the phone. Across the room, Claire saw his hesitation and understood that another scene was unfolding somewhere else, in a penthouse or a car or a restaurant booth, where Vanessa was learning that access was not the same as power. Claire felt no urge to witness it. There had been a time when she imagined Vanessa's downfall would feel like justice. It did not. It felt like the removal of expensive wallpaper from a damaged wall. Necessary, revealing, but not the foundation. At 8:35, after the last employee had been directed to the proper team, Claire finally stepped into the hallway. The building was quieter now, its glass walls reflecting empty desks and the blue glow of computer screens left awake. Near the elevator, Ethan stood alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city behind him glittered in pieces, and Claire remembered standing beside him at parties years ago while he told men twice his age that loyalty was the core of his business. He had never understood that loyalty could not be extracted. It had to be deserved. "They trust you already," he said. His voice carried no sarcasm this time, only exhaustion. Claire pressed the elevator button. "No," she said. "They are giving me a chance not to betray them. That is different." He looked at her as if the distinction hurt more than an accusation. Was I really that blind? The elevator doors opened, spilling soft light across the marble floor. Claire stepped inside, then turned back. You were not blind, Ethan. You saw what was useful to you. The doors began to close, but not before she saw his face change. Not dramatically, not enough for forgiveness, but enough to know the sentence had reached him. As the elevator descended, Claire leaned her shoulder lightly against the wall and closed her eyes for the first time all evening. She was tired down to the bone, but it was a clean tired, earned tired, the kind that came after carrying something heavy to the right place and finally setting it down. The lobby was nearly empty when Claire stepped out of the elevator, the marble floor reflecting the overhead lights in long pale bands. Through the revolving doors, Manhattan moved with its usual indifference, yellow cabs sliding along the curb, pedestrians crossing against the signal, a delivery cyclist balancing dinner orders in a thermal bag, as if the fate of a failed investment firm meant nothing besides someone's late noodles. Claire loved the city for that. It did not pause for anyone's private disaster. It let people fall apart and rebuild on the same block, under the same traffic lights, without asking for a press statement. Daniel caught up to her near the security desk with his coat over one arm. The employee memo is out, he said. Human Resources confirmed the benefits language. Press release is with legal. Marissa is staying upstairs with Peter and the audit team. Claire nodded, but her eyes had drifted to the glass doors. Outside, a black car idled near the curb. In its tinted reflection, she saw not the woman who had taken control of Whitmore Capital, but the outline of someone standing very still after a long climb. Go home, Daniel said gently. You have been running since 5 this morning. Claire almost laughed. 5 this morning was nothing. She had once run for 5 years without anyone noticing. I will, she said. After one stop. He did not ask where. Good employees knew when silence was part of the job. 20 minutes later, Claire's car rolled through Brooklyn, away from the towers, over streets that still held pieces of her first life after Ethan. Laundromats glowing blue-white, corner bodegas with handwritten signs, narrow brownstones, basement apartments with curtains drawn against the night. The driver turned onto a quieter street in Carroll Gardens and stopped across from a small brick building with a faded green awning. The coffee shop was closed, its chairs stacked on tables, its front window dark except for the ghostly reflection of passing headlights. Claire did not get out immediately. She sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap, looking at the corner table by the window. It was still there. Different chairs now, newer paint on the walls, but the table remained, small and square and ordinary enough to go unnoticed by anyone who had not once built a future from its uneven surface. At that table, she had learned to charge for her mind. At that table, she had cried quietly over a rejected proposal, celebrated a $300 invoice, eaten grocery store soup from a paper container, and taught herself that survival was not a personality flaw. The driver waited without speaking. Claire appreciated him for it. After a moment, she opened her portfolio and removed a folded copy of the signed acquisition agreement. The Bennett Holdings letterhead looked almost unreal under the streetlight, crisp and formal, as if it belonged to someone who had always known where she was going. Claire knew better. Most lives were not built by confidence. They were built by continuing while confidence was unavailable. Her phone buzzed. A message from Marissa. Ethan has left the building. Vanessa is requesting a meeting tomorrow. Claire typed back. No meeting until documentation is complete. Then she turned the phone face down. Vanessa could wait. Ethan could wait. The world that had once demanded Claire's immediate emotional labor could finally learn the luxury of her absence. She looked again at the coffee shop window and remembered the first client who had shaken her hand there, a bakery owner named Mrs. Alvarez, who had paid in cash from a flour-dusted envelope and said, "You listen like someone who knows what it costs to be ignored." Claire had carried that sentence like a lantern. It had guided her more than any business book, more than any investor meeting, more than all the polished advice from men who had never had to prove they deserved a room they were already standing in. The car pulled away, and Claire watched the coffee shop disappear behind her. She did not feel nostalgic. Nostalgia softened too much. What she felt was recognition. The woman at that table had not been weak. She had been underfunded, underestimated, and exhausted, which men like Ethan often mistook for defeat because imagination had never been their strongest asset. As the car crossed back toward the river, Claire rested her head against the seat and let the city lights blur into gold. Tomorrow would bring headlines, meetings, lawyers, frightened investors, angry calls, and the slow, unglamorous work of repairing what pride had damaged. But tonight, for the first time in years, she allowed herself one private truth. She had not returned to Ethan's world. She had outgrown it, bought the parts worth saving, and left the rest behind. The press release went out at 7:30 the next morning, and by 7:42, the financial news sites had found the part of the story they liked best. Bennett Holdings acquires controlling stake in Whitmore Capital. Founder Ethan Whitmore to step down after transition. Private restructuring firm led by Claire Bennett takes control. Claire read the headlines from her office in Dumbo with a paper cup of coffee cooling beside her and the East River turning silver beyond the windows. She had expected the attention. Daniel had prepared for it with the calm pessimism of a man who understood both reporters and human nature, two species equally addicted to blood in the water. What Claire had not expected was the first photograph every outlet chose to use. It was from a gala 9 years earlier. Ethan stood at a podium in a black tuxedo, smiling beneath a chandelier, while Claire stood half a step behind him in a pale blue dress, her hands folded, her face turned toward him with the careful pride of a woman who believed she was part of something shared. The caption called her his former wife. Not founder, not strategist, not the woman whose documents had just rewritten the history of his company. His former wife. Claire looked at the image for a long moment, then closed the tab. Some cages survived longest in language. By 9 o'clock, Bennett Holdings was full of movement. Phones rang, printers hummed, analysts crossed the floor with folders pressed to their chests, and Marissa stood near the glass wall directing calls with the precision of an air traffic controller. Daniel walked into Claire's office holding a tablet. 3 networks want interviews. 2 business magazines want profiles. 1 columnist is already calling this a revenge acquisition. Claire looked up. Decline the networks. Schedule 1 print interview for next week. And correct the columnist. Daniel raised one eyebrow. With what language? It was not revenge. It was risk management. For the first time that morning, Daniel smiled. That may be the most Bennett sentence ever spoken. Before Claire could answer, her assistant, Emily Hart, appeared at the door with an expression that suggested civilization had once again failed to behave. Vanessa Cole is in the lobby, Emily said. She says she has an appointment. Claire glanced at her calendar. Empty. She does not. She says Ethan told her you would see her. Claire let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh. Even now, Ethan was trying to send women into rooms to manage the consequences he did not want to face himself. Bring her to conference room 2, Claire said. Daniel's smile vanished. You do not have to meet with her. I know. Conference room 2 was smaller than the boardroom Claire used for acquisitions, with a round table, gray chairs, and windows overlooking warehouses converted into apartments for people who paid too much money to live inside renovated brick. Vanessa entered 7 minutes later wearing winter white, oversized sunglasses, and the expression of someone who had mistaken glamour for immunity. She was still beautiful, but beauty under stress had a way of revealing its architecture. The smile came first, bright and artificial. Claire, she said, as if they were 2 old friends inconvenienced by paperwork. Claire remained seated. Ms. Bennett. Vanessa removed her sunglasses slowly. Is that really necessary? Today, yes. The smile thinned. Vanessa sat across from her without being invited, placing a designer handbag on the chair beside her like a witness. I think there has been a misunderstanding, she began. Claire opened the folder in front of her. There have been several. Vanessa's eyes flickered to the papers, then back to Claire's face. My advisory role was approved by Ethan. That is not the issue. Then what is? Claire turned 1 page. The issue is that invoices from your consulting entity were categorized as client development expenses, despite records showing personal event planning, image management, and social appearances unrelated to revenue. The audit will determine whether those classifications were improper. Until then, all payments are suspended. Vanessa's composure cracked just enough to show the panic beneath. You are trying to humiliate me. Claire studied her, and for a moment the room seemed to fold backward into that charity luncheon. Vanessa smiling over white tablecloths. asking whether Claire had found something meaningful to do with her free time. How strange, Claire thought, that people often recognized humiliation only when it returned wearing paperwork. No, Claire said. I am asking for receipts. Vanessa stared at her, as if receipts were a form of cruelty invented by accountants. Ethan said you would do this. Ethan has said many inaccurate things. The silence stretched. Vanessa looked toward the windows, then down at her hands. Without the sunglasses, without the audience, without Ethan beside her as proof of conquest, she seemed younger than Claire remembered, not innocent, but less invincible. You got everything, Vanessa said softly. The company, the room, the respect. Was that not enough? Claire closed the folder. You still think respect is something taken from another woman? Vanessa looked up sharply. Claire stood then, not angry, not triumphant, simply finished. What I have now was not yours to give me, and it was not Ethan's to take from me. That is the part both of you never understood. Vanessa said nothing. There was no dramatic collapse, no public scene, no satisfying confession. Just a woman in a beautiful coat realizing that proximity to power was not the same as having any of her own. Claire walked to the door and opened it. The audit team will contact your attorney. Vanessa rose slowly, gathering her handbag with hands that were not quite steady. As she passed, she paused as if searching for one final graceful wound. None came. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Claire stood alone in the quiet conference room, feeling the old chapter lose another page. 3 months later, the old Whitmore Capital sign came down on a cold Friday morning while office workers hurried past with coffee cups, scarves, and the practiced impatience of New Yorkers pretending not to watch. Claire stood across the street beneath a gray sky, her hands tucked into the pockets of a camel coat, watching 2 installers loosen the polished metal letters from the stone wall. The name had looked permanent once. That was the trick of expensive things. Marble, brass, family money, glossy photographs. All of it could convince people that power was built to last. But permanence was often just maintenance with better lighting. Behind her, Daniel spoke quietly into his phone, managing reporters, who wanted a cleaner ending than life usually provided. Ethan had stepped down the week before. The board had approved the transition. The audit had exposed enough misclassification, vanity spending, and reckless projections to end the myth without turning the company into a spectacle. Several senior executives resigned. Most employees stayed. Clients who had prepared to leave began returning calls. Payroll never missed. Health benefits held. The work was not glamorous, but it was real, and Claire had come to prefer real things. Across the street, the final letter of Whitmore was lowered into a padded crate. For one strange moment, the building looked nameless, like a person between identities. Then the new sign arrived, wrapped in protective cloth. Bennett Holdings. The letters were brushed steel, simple and clean, without the theatrical shine Ethan would have chosen. Claire felt her throat tighten, not with triumph, but with memory. Her mother's notebook. The hotel room off Interstate 95. The coffee shop table in Brooklyn. Mrs. Alvarez pressing cash into her palm. Marissa staying past midnight to fix a payroll issue. Nora from reception crying quietly when her husband's surgery coverage was confirmed. None of those moments would appear in the articles. Articles preferred turning women into symbols, because symbols were easier to digest than labor. Claire knew better. This name had not been built from revenge. It had been built from invoices, sleepless nights, corrected mistakes, hard conversations, and the daily refusal to become what had hurt her. A Blacktown car stopped at the curb behind her. Claire glanced over and saw Ethan step out. He looked different without the armor of the executive suite. His coat was dark, his face tired, his hair touched more openly with gray. For a moment, Daniel moved as if to intercept him, but Claire lifted one hand slightly, and he stayed back. Ethan crossed the sidewalk slowly, stopping a few feet from her. Traffic moved between them and the building, impatient and loud. I heard the sign was going up today, he said. Claire kept her eyes on the installers. It is. He nodded, swallowing whatever speech he had rehearsed on. The ride over. I wanted to say that I understand more now than I did then. Claire turned toward him. There was a time when that sentence would have fed something starving inside her. A time when she would have gathered it carefully, warmed her hands over it, mistaken it for justice. Now it was only a sentence, and she was grateful to discover she did not need it. I hope you do, she said. Ethan looked at the new letters being raised into place. I was wrong about you. Claire's expression did not change, but the cold air seemed to pass more gently through her lungs. You were wrong about yourself, too. He looked at her then, and for once he did not argue. The first letter caught the morning light as the installers secured it to the wall. B, then E, then N, a name becoming visible one piece at a time. Ethan lowered his gaze. Do you hate me? Claire considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, which was less than it would have demanded years ago and more than bitterness would have allowed. No, she said. Hate is too much space to give someone who no longer owns a room in my life. He absorbed that quietly. It was not forgiveness, not exactly. It was freedom, and freedom did not always arrive smiling. Sometimes it arrived as a locked door you finally stopped knocking on. Ethan left without another word. Claire watched him merge into the crowd, just another man in a dark coat moving through a city that had never belonged to him as completely as he imagined. When she turned back, the full sign was in place. Bennett Holdings. Her name against stone and glass, not behind a husband, not buried in a settlement, not whispered with pity over white tablecloths. Daniel came to stand beside her. It looks good, he said. Claire smiled faintly. It looks honest. That afternoon, she returned to the office and found a small envelope on her desk. Inside was a photograph Emily had taken from across the street. Claire standing beneath the new sign, looking not victorious, but peaceful. On the back, Marissa had written, for the woman who priced every skill they said did not count. Claire placed the photograph beside her mother's notebook in the top drawer of her desk. Then she opened the next file, because empires were not monuments. They were responsibilities. And somewhere, in another failing company, another invisible person was waiting for someone powerful to remember what it felt like to be overlooked. 6 months after the sign changed, Bennett Holdings held its first annual employee meeting in the same auditorium where Claire had once stood before frightened Whitmore staff and asked them to believe honesty could become a foundation. The room looked different now, though the walls had not changed. The blue stage lights were gone, replaced by warmer lighting that made people look like people instead of promotional material. The screen behind the lectern did not show a soaring graph or a slogan about excellence. It showed names. Nora Ellis, whose husband had recovered well enough to send Claire a thank you card written in careful block letters. Peter Sloan, who had stayed through the audit, admitted what he should have confronted earlier, and rebuilt the finance department with more humility than anyone expected. 2 junior analysts who had warned leadership about risk and were now leading internal review teams. Mrs. Alvarez's bakery appeared in one slide too, not because it had anything to do with acquisitions, but because Claire insisted the company remember where its philosophy began, with small businesses, overlooked workers, and people who knew the cost of being ignored. When Claire walked onto the stage, the applause came quickly this time, not cautious, not fearful, not purchased by performance. She waited for it to settle, her hands resting lightly on the lectern. In the front row, Marissa sat with a folder balanced on her knees. Daniel leaned back with his arms crossed, and the faintly tired expression of a man who had survived too many news cycles, and Emily held a pen ready, as if the world might collapse if she stopped taking notes. Claire looked across the room and felt, for the first time in years, no ghost standing beside her. Ethan had moved to Connecticut, according to an article she did not finish reading. Vanessa's audit had ended in repayment agreements and a quiet disappearance from the business. Pages. Grant Hollis had left his old firm. The city had swallowed them all into other stories, because cities were ruthless that way, and sometimes merciful. When Bennett Holdings took control of this company, Claire began. Many people expected a dramatic story, a revenge story, a headline with a villain, a victim, and a final scene where someone won and someone lost. She paused, letting the words settle into a room full of people who had read those headlines and lived beneath them. But businesses are not repaired by drama. Lives are not rebuilt by applause. They are rebuilt by decisions that nobody photographs. She looked toward Nora, then toward the analysts, then to the back rows where new employees stood along the wall, young and nervous and hopeful in that fragile way people are before the working world teaches them to hide it. There is a lesson I learned the hard way, Claire continued. Never confuse visibility with value. The person on the stage is not always the person doing the work. The person with the loudest name is not always the one carrying the weight. And when a company forgets that, it does not simply become unfair. It becomes weak. The room was silent, but not tense. It was the kind of silence people give when they are not waiting to be impressed, only to be told the truth. Claire thought of her mother's notebook in the top drawer of her desk, its worn leather corners softened by time. She thought of the sentence that had followed her from a cheap hotel room to this stage, through fear, humiliation, exhaustion, and finally, into peace. This company will not be built inside one person's ego, she said. It will not depend on one founder, one myth, or one polished version of history. It will carry many names, many hands, many second chances. But it will stand under mine because I know what that name cost. For a moment, emotion tightened her voice, and she let it. She no longer believed strength required pretending not to feel. There may be people in your life who decide what you are worth when you are tired, broke, embarrassed, or starting over. They may call your quietness weakness. They may call your labor support. They may call your dreams unrealistic until those dreams become profitable enough to interest them. A few people smiled softly. Some looked down. Some looked straight at her, as if she had opened a door they had been leaning against for years. Do not let them be the final accountant of your life. Claire closed the folder in front of her. Build carefully. Build honestly. Build in your own name. Even if the first version is small enough to fit on a coffee shop table. Especially then. The applause rose again, fuller this time, but Claire's eyes drifted past the room, through the glass doors, toward the hallway where the Bennett Holdings sign caught the morning light. She knew now that an empire was not proof that pain had been worth it. Pain was never noble simply because someone survived it. The empire was proof of something quieter and more useful, that what tried to erase her had failed, and what remained was finally hers.